Okay, so today I want to continue the theme of protected lands and nature-based tourism, but I now want to talk about it specifically from the perspective of where most of us are located, which is the wonderful state and subcontinent of Alaska. And so I have two case studies that I want to focus on today. The first one is from Seward, Alaska. If you're not familiar with the historic context of Seward, Alaska was occupied since time immemorial by Sugpiaq people, specifically Chukachmute Sugpiaq people. Today in Seward, you can find the Kutupaq Native tribe, as well as the Chugach Regional Corporation. As far as the town that we now think of as Seward as a settler establishment, this was founded in 1903. It was founded in large part related to the railroad, as far as a railroad that was being constructed all the way up into the far interior of Alaska related to the gold rush, but it was started all the way down at Seward. Seward also became the starting point for the Iditarod, which before it was a big dog race, was also the trail by which mail was taken to rural Alaska Native villages. And so Seward was sort of established as a gateway, if you will, to other parts of Alaska, especially the interior parts of Alaska. It experienced devastation. It was growing quite a bit for a while and got a reasonably sized city for quite a while. It was a pretty good sized city. I think at one point it might have been the largest city in Alaska. Actually, it experienced tragedy on 1964 with the Good Friday earthquake, which you're probably familiar with, when 121 people were killed in Seward, and which really demolished a significant portion of the city. And since then, for several decades, they were in a rebuilding phase with their economy somewhat struggling, although still existing and being heavily geared towards fishing operations. But somehow we go from that in kind of the 70s, 80s, this kind of rebuilding phase, to what we think of as Seward today. For those of you who haven't been to Seward, it is very much a tourism hub. When I first moved to Alaska, I heard from people who were like, oh yeah, I took a cruise to Alaska. Oh yeah, I took a cruise to Alaska. And inevitably what they meant was they took a cruise that went up into Seward. Seward is, this is a Google result. If you type in Seward and tourism, it says small in size, big on adventure. Welcome to Seward, gateway to Kenai Fjords National Park. So yeah, it's located immediately adjacent to and kind of at the start of Kenai Fjords National Park, which is a very large national park that covers much of the eastern and southern portion of the Kenai Peninsula and includes these absolutely amazing carved out fjord mountains. So very, very gorgeous. So we now think of it very much as a tourism hub spot. If you visit during the summer, you'll find that in the campgrounds that are across the coast of it, or along the waterfront, I should say, they're absolutely packed. Almost every single campsite is taken by either an RV or a tent camper. A lot of times people from all over, or sometimes people just from other parts of the state. I go to a Seward camping trip, at least one every year. There's a very, very popular aquarium, really our main aquarium for the state, the Alaska Sea Life Center, which is also a pretty prominent aquarium on the national scene as well. But there's the Alaska Sea Life Center, which of course partners with the University of Alaska, but that's a story for another day. But they do a lot of rehabilitation work for wildlife. But so tons of camping, tons of visitors, nice, somewhat small but beautiful kind of downtown area where, again, you visit during the summer and you're going to see people all over. And, you'll see often a cruise ship or two in dock. And then you also have like several, like maybe a dozen, I've never counted them, but operators that do like marine mammal tours that will take you out to see the Kenai Fjords, like take you out to Fox Island and do a lunch out there, take you to go see whales, stuff like this. You have Lowell Point, which is a popular beach destination. You have some really popular hiking trails around Lowell Point. where again, if you go visit during the summer, it's basically going to be absolutely packed and you're not going to find parking. So I sound like I'm kind of doing an ad for Seward at the moment, and I don't mean to. I'm not like paid for by the city of Seward or something. I don't live in Seward, but I'm trying to suggest that it's a pretty remarkable city, but one whose economy, I don't want to say it's fully dependent on tourism. That would not be true at all, but certainly it's one that's heavily influenced by tourism. Just as one final kind of anecdotal example of my own, you go there during the summer and you go to Safeway, and it is very common to find, let's take bottled water as an example, almost all water in the store gone because there are so many tourists that are buying up all the bottled waters in the entire Safeway that the Safeway can't even keep up. So very tourism heavy now, but a few decades ago was a town that was really struggling, and in the meantime was a town that was sort of rebuilding but heavily basing itself on a fishing economy, not a tourism economy. Although fishing continues to be an important part of Seward and of Seward identity, for example, with their silver salmon derby that they do every fall. Tourism at this point, I would say, is a really dominant theme in what Seward, how Seward at least outwardly presents itself to the world, and is a pretty major driver of Seward economy. This is an aerial view of Seward, by the way. Pretty sure that's the aquarium right there, the Sea Life Center, if I'm not mistaken. This is a picture of the Kenai Fjords. Very popular national park. Very, very beautiful, as you can tell. Huge, glorious rock outcroppings and things like that. Very likely to see all sorts of different whales and things like that. Beautiful stuff. The story of how it became a tourist destination, I had you do a reading on that. And as the reading suggested, it was already sort of becoming a tourist destination. By the 80s, they already had about 100 different little like local businesses or people that in one way or another were starting to get involved in the tourism industry. And so that was starting to pick up. However, it took a huge acceleration right around the time of another sort of disaster that affected that area. So in 1989 was the Exxon Valdez oil spill. And you're probably familiar with this already. This happened a few years into my own life. So I grew up hearing about this all the time because it was kind of this like textbook example of the dangers of oil spills and like when things go wrong, as well as kind of what remediation can or can't do. So taking science classes and stuff growing up, you would hear about this. Other folks may have heard more or less about this. I don't know. Around here in Alaska, you know, if you live on the Kenai Peninsula, sometimes you'll find things that were like things that were funded from the settlement money. But anyways, 1989, the Exxon Valdez oil spill. The circumstances behind it are complicated. I am not going to take a position on those. I will note the effect, though. The effect is that it went aground, is spilled, and 11 million gallons of oil leaked in to, generally speaking, the Prince William Sound area or the Gulf of Alaska area. This map is from the trustee council. So there's a trustee council that oversees the settlement money that Exxon was required to pay to Alaska. And as you can see, they've got essentially all of this like south/east portion of the Kenai Peninsula, even up into like Homer area, and then a chunk of the Alaska Peninsula as well. Other maps that you'll find are less conservative. I don't mean that politically, I mean that more like less restricted and more broad. And so this map puts the spill area as essentially all of this, all up and down the Alaska Peninsula, far up into the Cook Inlet and so forth, with 1,500 miles of coastline affected, which I would say matches data that I've heard as well. It was a huge oil spill. It is definitely not the top oil spill that we've ever seen, but its environmental impact was outsized. And I've heard the statement that it was still the most environmentally destructive sort of marine oil spill of a tanker, partly because it was in such an ecologically sort of valued area in a sense that a lot of people wanted to keep that area very healthy for fishing and for different things, as well as for tourism. But anyways, it was very, very destructive in terms of the effects that it had. Calculating the number of animals killed would be extremely difficult because, as this from the trustee council notes, most of the carcasses would never be recovered, most of the animal corpses, unfortunately. But we did find 35,000 birds, 1,000 sea otters. Again, that's very, very small compared to probably what it actually was. billions of salmon and herring eggs. As a result of this, you look 25 years later, this is NOAA data, so data from the feds. This is basically a timeline that shows when different populations got back to, if not the same level, at least a stable level. And as you can see, some things were in the area recovered quicker than others. But even for something like bald eagle to say that, it was 7 years not recovered, kind of a significant lifespan, especially when you consider something as ecologically important as a bald eagle. 1999 for river otters, sockeyes taken and pinks taken until 2002, pretty major for a salmon dependent area. Indeed, the Chugach Corporation, which is an Alaska Native regional corporation, was heavily tied up with commercial fishing, and they ended up going bankrupt, not solely because of the Exxon Valdez spill, but that was certainly a contributing factor, because to a great degree, the commercial fishery in the Prince William Sound area was crashed for a while. And so that was one of the contributing factors to Chugach having to declare financial bankruptcy. Things like harbor sale took until 2006. So that's, 16 years. And then you have certain kinds of things that are still not fully recovered, right? And killer whale population, great example. And then you have things that are just not recovered at all. And so herring population, from what I've heard, this data supports that, has been essentially decimated by the Exxon Valdez oil spill. And, that's not an insignificant thing, especially when you consider that herring was a heavily utilized fishery source by some native groups historically. So Exxon Valdez had a major impact. Now, the reading pointed, so I don't want to at all, so I want to emphasize the profound effect it had. The reading took kind of an interesting stance in pointing out that although there was this huge impact, that it had kind of an unexpected effect for Seward specifically. Before we get into the effect it had on Seward, though, I want to point out some notes on research design. Anytime we read an article like this, where somebody says how they did their research, I would love for your ears to perk up, like little Lucy's. Anyways, I would love for your ears to perk up, because if you're going to go into anthropology as a career, or any other kind of field like social work, journalism, anything involving people, this is useful information to see how they did their interviews, right? This is the kind of stuff that you'll want to know if you go work for, let's take as an example, NOAA or National Park Service or something like that. It's useful to know how you do a study like this. Also, if you're going on to grad studies for anthropology or other social sciences, also very useful to know how to do these kinds of research, because you'll probably need to do that to get your degree. So I note that they used snowball sampling. Snowball sampling can be done in really precise ways, where it's like where you track every single contact. More often what people mean by that is basically that you ask each interviewee to other people that you should be interviewing, and then follow up on those contacts and just keep tracking it until you feel like you've kind of gone as far as you can go in the community, or that you've kind of reached satiation where you're getting a lot of the same feedback and you've kind of gotten the kind of key sectors of the community. And as you can see, this researcher, Kate Coddington, very helpfully, not everybody does this kind of thing, but very helpfully kind of pointed out her sample size, which was 15, and where she was drawing from. So 8 of these folks worked for parks, 8 of these folks worked for the tourism, 2 for fishing, 5 politicians, etc. Very helpful when you can be specific about your data, so you're not over or underselling what it is you found. Now, 15 might seem like a really small sample size compared to, let's say, surveys that might work with thousands of people, like the kind of election surveys that we do. It's worth pointing out that although ethnography oftentimes does have very small sample size relative to large-scale surveys, that it can also go much deeper usually than large-scale surveys. People are only going to pay attention so long for an online survey or a phone survey, and they may or may not be very truthful in what they answer. Interviews really allow us to go deep and go far with the folks that we're interviewing. So done right, 15 interviews, believe it or not, can give you quite a bit of data. I'm not suggesting this is the be all end all, and I would have liked to have seen a higher sample size than this, as I would like to sometimes in my own research, but sometimes my own research has, 10 to 20 people, right? It's sometimes just the nature of a field project, especially if you're only there for a little while. And so I think you can say some important things. I think there's things you're not able to speak to when you've only interviewed that number of people, but I think there are things that you are able to speak to. And part of what you need to look for is, at what point am I hearing the same things over and over again? And that's usually a sign. If you're hearing the same things over and over from people from diverse backgrounds, you're probably hitting pay dirt. You're finding real trends, even if your sample size is relatively small. And, also worth considering the size of community as well. As she points out, her sample size is about 1.5% of, that can't be right. She's saying they're 1.5% of Seward's population. That can't be right. Okay, anyways. So Kate Coddington, though, found some really interesting things. One of the things that she found out was that when the oil spill happened, huge amounts of money started being influxed into Seward, the reason being that Exxon was paying the bills for a remediation effort, partly because it was sort of legally / by public outrage being compelled to, but paying bills for remediation. There was a lot of different remediation things that were done. Dawn dish soap loves to make a thing of how Dawn dish soap was sometimes used to like clean off the little ducks and stuff. More to the point, things like spraying of hot water onto the beaches to get rid of the oil, using of big booms, what do you call it, like excavators basically, to like dig up the soil, use of microbes to do kind of like microbial remediation, where you use bacteria to try to break down the oil. All of that stuff takes people. You need people to run that. And so people were getting funded by Exxon to do these remediation efforts, and a lot of the remediation efforts were run through a few different kind of coastal cities, one of which was Seward. So a lot of money was moving into Seward as these kind of seasonal workers came in to do remediation. So suddenly the town booms in terms of population, and booms with all these people that are really cash flush. And you got to think that starts circulating money around the whole town, because that's also, those people have got to eat, those people have got to pay for gas, those people have got to grab groceries and pay for utilities. So the money's going to start circulating. It was a time when you suddenly kind of had a cash flush into Seward. And as a result, and also you had a bunch of those people, some of whom looked around, as the paper pointed out, and said, hey, Seward's beautiful. I'll actually settle down here, not just work here seasonally. So as a result, you had new people as well as new money. And as a result, as the reading pointed out, some people chose to invest that money into things like boats that they could use for sightseeing tours, to go see whales, stuff like that, right? Although she doesn't explicitly say this, I would assume that also some people chose to invest it in things like upgrading a hotel or building a new hotel, right? So people were investing it in tourism industries. And the way they spoke about it was very much as like entrepreneurial kind of things, right? People like cunningly choosing to invest their money wisely and then becoming successful based off all this new money. And certainly the tourism industry sort of took off in Seward. It was already big. It was 60,000 visitors annually in 1989, but increased to 264,000 annually by 1998. And when you consider the fact that this all happened amidst the backdrop of a major environmental disaster, admittedly one where some areas were hit harder, but still amidst the backdrop of a major environmental disaster in the area, they 1, 2, 3, 4 essentially quadrupled the size of the tourism industry. That is wild, to say the least. As she points out, though, I really liked this part. Coddington points out, in order for residents to capitalize on nature tourism, they had to see that the surrounding natural resources both existed and could become a source of profit. For many people, such as this long-term resident, before Seward became a tourist destination, it was simply their backyard. I just didn't think about it. It's just where we live. So this is sort of the opposite of that whole idea of like dualism that we've been talking a lot about, right? Instead of seeing oneself as super apart from the beauties of Seward, and it is really beautiful, right? You go visit Seward, the whole coastline, you just look across the bay, across Resurrection Bay, and just gorgeous fjords, right? And you look the other direction, you've got Mount Marathon, it's beautiful. But people said, I didn't think about it before, it was just where we live, right? I mean, obviously, I think people knew it was beautiful. A lot of people come to Alaska for a reason. But on some level, they become sort of used to it, as I think we can all become sometimes. They say we can even look out the window and see whales or seals or whatsoever. But then they said, so we were really overwhelmed that people were excited about that because that's just the way of life up here, right? So they were excited that new people were coming and staying in the town and or starting to do sightseeing tours and having even more people come in to do the sightseeing tours because they're like, oh yeah, like we're just sort of used to it, but you're right, like it is really cool, right? I was like, I can't believe I've not been on this tour. This is one resident who decide the boat tours start, and then they're like, okay, well, I'll go do it. And they're like, I can't believe I've not been on this tour because it's absolutely phenomenal. They say after getting to see the fjords, which are a little distance, the Kenai Fjords tour will take you a little distance from Seward. They say, and then from your own experience, you can say it's worth every penny that you pay. I know why people come to see it. It's breathtaking. So one of the things Coddington suggests, and I think it's an interesting idea, is that people started to view the nature around them differently. Again, I would argue it's a slight pushback to Coddington. I think people already realized it was beautiful. I think, though, they started to further appreciate the beauty of it, especially as they sort of saw it through the lens of what we sometimes would call like the tourist gaze, right? Seeing it, so to speak, through the lens of the people who are coming into your community and experiencing it for the first time. Bit of a paradox there too, as Coddington emphasizes, that is right as the environment in a sense is starting to feel much more precarious because there's this oil spill that they're trying to protect Resurrection Bay from, and they're trying to clean up oil as soon as they see any oil pop up on their coast. That at that time also probably fed into people thinking about it much more so as a precious commodity, right? Nature as not just a place where we fish, a place where we live, but also sort of nature as a thing that you view, and thus as a precious, and that tourists also come to view, and thus is sort of a precious commodity in that sense. It might sound weird to call it a commodity. I agree. And yet at the same time, people want and need to make a living. And this is a way that they can make a living that involves them looking at rather than destroying something. Of course, as Coddington points out, the visiting of an area can itself have major environmental impacts, right? There's a whole lot of cruise boats moving back and forth into Seward. So this is complex, right? At the one hand, viewing nature this way led people to want to sort of get oil out as quickly as they could so they could preserve this landscape that was so beautiful and that they were increasingly also seeing as a tourism draw, but then also the tourists themselves have an environmental impact by being there. This reminds me again of this idea we talked about a couple of weeks ago of landscapes, right? And this idea of how our identities are tied in with our landscapes. A community like Seward coming to think of itself very much, again, I think always had been, but thinking of itself even more as a place defined by the beauty of its surroundings. She also points out, though, and relates it to Foucault. If you haven't heard of Foucault, just go to graduate school. You'll get more Foucault than you ever wanted. But anyways, Michel Foucault was quite popular a couple of decades ago and still gets brought up quite a bit, especially by anthropologists and social scientists of a certain generation. My generation, basically, in that right above me. But Foucault is kind of this post-structural strain of thought that thinks, I will try not to overcomplicate theory here, but basically, Foucault was this French theorist that promoted these ideas that other scholars have also promoted, but like this idea that, well, he had lots of ideas, but one of his ideas is this idea of how governments and external institutions sometimes shift our subjectivities and change us into thinking of ourselves in certain ways, or that there's sometimes outside discourses that change how we think of ourselves. Right. And so in this case, Coddington suggests that people began to have their subjectivity, how they think of themselves, how they experience themselves started to change. She talks about this idea of bootstrap citizenship, that people started to think in terms of, oh, the people that got successful from tourism were the clever ones, the ones that invested in tourism. Whether that's true or not historically, right? We could maybe say, well, is that true, right? Were there other people that also made good investments and it just didn't pan out for one reason or another? There's a certain amount of randomness and chaos with a free market. But that's how people view it now, right? Or at least the 15 people she interviewed. Who knows if that's representative of Seward as a whole. She talks about this, though, as kind of a broader phenomenon of neoliberalization. But basically, neoliberalization, if you're not familiar with that term, among other things, is a term that gets used for, it's kind of like, since the 80s, we use the term neoliberalization to define essentially people or movements or ideologies or social movements or political parties or whatever that are strongly promoting a very pro-capitalist stance, and not just pro-capitalist, but sort of capitalism without the brakes on, is how I like to put it, like capitalism without government, like government get out of the way, if anything help, give us roads and infrastructure so that we can transport our goods, but don't regulate us, right? So sort of a push towards deregulation and the idea that individuals can prosper in this sort of free market economy if they work hard enough. So again, kind of bootstrap citizenship. So kind of an interesting idea. Thought Coddington did an interesting analysis. And whether you agree with it or not, I thought you might find it an interesting take on how a town goes from being kind of a railroad town to a town facing a disaster, to a fishing town, to a fishing, but also a huge amount of tourism town. So that's that. And next we're going to talk about Kenai, but let's break it there so that the video isn't insanely long. Thank you.